Hello, and thank you all for joining us today for Conversations and Experience, Reflections on the Hispanic and Latinx Experience in the United States, powered by People 3 Inc. My name is Camelia Clayton, and I am the Social Media and Marketing Manager for People 3. People 3 is a Nashville-based full-service diversity and inclusion firm that provides educational workshops and DEI consulting services, as well as DEI strategy solutions. The 2020 census report shows that Hispanic and Latinx Americans are the largest and fastest growing ethnic group in the country. The Hispanic and Latinx community plays an integral part in American culture and society today. The Hispanic and Latinx population represents over 20 beautiful countries across the world, and in honor of Hispanic Heritage Month, we want to recognize and celebrate each one and the ongoing influence they have in this country. We are here today to reflect on the personal experiences of our panelists, as well as to discuss steps toward creating a more inclusive culture and what that looks like in the future. We are honored to host this event and introduce our moderator, Lisette Delgado-Fitzgerald, who will introduce our panelists and guide this discussion. After a 20-year career in marketing and editorial, Lisette pivoted toward her true passion, empowering people through nonviolent communications, self-defense practice, empathy, and community. She is now head of the nonprofit she founded with her partner, ASSERT Empowerment Self-Defense, which focuses on providing empowerment self-defense. Lisette also heads ASSERT Professionals, an empowerment self-defense service provider for civilians, NGOs, and nonprofits looking to create safer protest and civil disobedience spaces and training for their activists, corporate clients looking for team building, safety training and protocols, law enforcement and security companies, and institutions looking to provide socially conscious, culturally relevant training to their officers, and even special operations teams in need of supplementary close quarters combat training. Lisette, welcome.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for hosting this wonderful discussion. It is absolutely my honor to introduce you to our panelists for today. We have Sara del Castillo, who was born in Mississippi. She is Peruvian, Bolivian American, which is a beautiful combination. She's been passionate about diverse, inclusive, and connected spaces. And having grown up in a multicultural immigrant community, she decided to study anthropology, sociology, and become an advocate for equity within the Latinx, LGBTQ, and BIPOC communities. As an advocate, she's worked with the United We Dream Network, the American Civil Liberties Union, People for the American Way, and AmeriCorps. After working as a Fulbright scholar in Spain, bravo, and Teach for America educator in New Orleans, she then became a human resources leader for a Latinx and immigrant serving nonprofit in Nashville, Tennessee. Sarah is also leadership and culture consultant for People 3. Thank you for joining us. We have Vilmarís González, who is a Jersey-born Boricua. Right on, Puerto Rico, que isla tan bella. Raised in rural Tennessee. Currently, she's the Senior Manager of Engagement and Operations for the Education Trust Tennessee, where she leads the Student Voice Initiatives, Partnership Engagement and Operations. She's also a Master's of Education candidate, at Vanderbilt University's Peabody College of Education and Learning, and the Learning, Diversity, and Urban Studies program. Her research happens to focus on participatory action research, culturally responsive pedagogy, and critical race theory. Thank you for teaching, and thank you for your focus. It's hard work that needs to be done, so thank you so much. Vilmarís also has led and designed leadership development and advocacy programs for youth and adult learners in the nonprofit sector, both abroad and in the US. Thank you for joining us. Yuri Cunza is the Hispanic American social entrepreneur media professional, business leader, and community advocate that serves as president and CEO of the Nashville Area Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. He's the founder and editor-in-chief of the Spanish language newspaper La Noticia, which if you haven't read, you should. He's owner and founder of Y&K, a strategic media solutions support and consulting service based out of Nashville. In 2018, Yuri was selected to serve on the United States Hispanic Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors, serving as chair of Region 6, which represents 7 states and Puerto Rico. Again, we're back to the beautiful island. Yuri Cunza serves on the Tennessee Advisory Committee for the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition and the Partnership for New American Economy. Thank you as well for joining us. Sunny Eaton is currently the director of Conviction Review Unit, the Conviction Review Unit for the Nashville DA's office. That's a tough job. For the last 10 years, Sunny has operated her own law firm, practicing primarily criminal defense and trademark law. Before that, she was with the Nashville Public Defender's Office, when in 2015, Sunny, her wife Karen, and their dog Gracie sold everything they owned, spent 2.5 years traveling by car and camping throughout the US, Canada, Mexico, and América Central America, visiting 13 countries. Sunny has published a book about the women she encountered in her travels titled I Can, I Will. I'm sorry, but that's a really moving title, and I'm immediately buying your book. And has written articles for top-tier magazines on topics related to both criminal justice issues and car-based international travel. Traveling alone as a woman through some of the parts that you have driven through and gone to check out is quite a risk, and I take my hat off to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
That takes us to Hernando Sevilla Garcia, who is Assistant Director for IES Abroad. After spending a year in the organization's academics department as the program associate, he now strategizes with international higher education stakeholders to implement diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and ultimately increase the participation of minority students in study abroad, something that we desperately need access to as Latinx and Hispanics studying in the US. A recipient of the Gates Millennium and Quest Bridge scholarships. Wow, that's super impressive. He started his undergrad career at the University of Pennsylvania and completed a Bachelor of Arts in History and Political Science with minors in Portuguese, interdisciplinary Latino-Latina studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Thank you so much for joining us. I am like completely blown away by your resume, by the way, just FYI. We then go to Andrés Martínez, who is the Director of Policy and Communications for Conexión América, Tennessee's leading Latino-serving nonprofit, which is dedicated to building a welcoming community and creating opportunities where Latino families can belong, contribute, and succeed. We have a nice, tight-knit, but small Hispanic community, and the work that you guys do is pretty darn important. Andrés serves on the board of directors of Nashville Pride, the LGBTQ organization responsible for the annual Pride celebration, and at the Oasis Center, an organization serving Nashville's youth. In 2019, Andrés was elected by the Metropolitan Council to serve on Nashville's new Community Oversight Board, the city's first civilian oversight board of law enforcement. Yes, please, all day. Since August of 2020, he has served as the chair of the city's Community Oversight Board, leading the agency as it establishes its place as a voice for the community. Welcome to you as well, Andrés. And welcome to all of our viewers. Hopefully we will have some time for some questions at the end. And we hope that the questions that we will be addressing today will answer some of your concerns. I'm sure that, and forgive me if I'm speaking for you, but I'm sure that our panelists would be happy to take not just your questions, but maybe hear from you afterwards on ways that you can support the Latino and Hispanic communities in your areas. So what do you say we get right to the questions? That sound like a plan, everybody? So my first question is going to go to Yuri. And I was wondering if you could tell me, or talk to us actually, about the Hispanic and Latinx experience. How has it changed and evolved in the United States? And how do you see that change continuing for the better? Has it been, or maybe it needs improvement? You know, give me a little bit of insight as to what that looks like now and going forward.
Well, thank you. That is a complex question and probably deserves a complex answer in a way. I came to the U.S. in 1992. I mean, things that perhaps some of you here, which I'm assuming you look pretty younger than me, will not be able to relate because it takes time to actually process change. And the question is, has it changed, or what is that experience? Well, when I came to Nashville first, I remember being greeted on Cinco de Mayo. And I was born in Peru, so I had no idea what that meant. And I kind of took it a little offensive in a way because, you know, you have this identity that you come with. I feel better now, years after, because I learned to appreciate. I actually visited Puebla in Mexico to understand that this is something that we celebrate in the U.S. more than what you celebrate in Mexico, unless you're in that particular area, right? So it's a mix of things, but well, I cannot blame anyone who grew up seeing certain examples of what being a Latino is in this particular community, such as perhaps the only people you knew work in construction or landscaping or housekeeping. So I cannot blame people for that perception. What is that experience is that it's unknown to many how complex it is, how diverse we are, coming from 21 different countries or more, and having different histories and backgrounds. Has it changed? I think the understanding that there is diversity within the Hispanic community, I think it's more visible. We do our part trying to make sure people understand that when we recognize Hispanic Heritage Month, it's not recognizing a foreign celebration. It's an American recognition of all of those who trace their roots to Spanish-speaking countries, and that our community is not just coming from one particular part of the Spanish-speaking world. It's not everyone from Mexico, from Central America, which it's also complex right there. But despite that, I think there is a fact that there are more of us that are taking a leading role within the structures and the systems. What we wish for that to be more, especially in Nashville. As I said earlier, I just came from a National Hispanic Chamber Conference. This is not California, not Texas, or not Florida, where we are more visible and much more represented. So is it changing? Maybe, but it's a lot not known, and we just need to do our part. If you have the chance to become acquainted with one, I guess, try to be more intentional about getting to know one person or two every year that could represent perhaps a little bit of what our Hispanic roots represent. Yep, that's my story.
So it sounds a little bit like what you're saying is that there has been some positive change in that years ago when you first came, sort of the entirety of the culture was lumped into just sort of this one box. without recognition of the variety within the Hispanic and Latinx culture? Am I to understand that?
Yeah, well, there are more, like, overall, Hollywood has more Latinos in leading roles, for instance. There are some Latinos who are prominent in politics, perhaps healthcare now with COVID, advances on that, but it's going to take some of that, incorporating that's such a huge segment of the market, 62 plus million Hispanics, and he's not counting all of those who do not have a certain legal status. So you add all of that. I mean, we're definitely a large minority group in the U.S., and that needs the recognition and representation. So here it's slow to adjust. Still, there's some stigmas. I was asked, I remember back in 1992, I was asked if I spoke Mexican, in addition to being greeted on Cinco de Mayo. And also I was called amigo loosely because to us, that is a very important word that only comes after you really have that experience of friendship that can signify you calling someone a friend. So all of those things still may remain, but I think it's a little more respect because the community in other parts of the country have been a lot more visible and recognized. And I hope that also comes back to Nashville. There is this stereotype of Hispanics being undocumented. And I know it is a fact for many. And it's a complex situation there that probably deserves a whole session on its own to cover. But there's a lot more than that. And I appreciate very much the hardworking segment of our community who has been essential workers, and they're carrying really the responsibility to keep things open and keep things going. And that's not acknowledged or recognized. We like numbers, we like all of those stats that can, I guess, validate a little bit of the presence. We could do better.
Thank you. Sunny, I think that you had wanted to chime in on this one as well a little bit.
I did, thank you. I really agree and identify with a lot of what Yuri just said. I think that our experience has changed primarily in representation. I know for me growing up, when I was young, this was a primary issue of my youth, was not seeing myself in any area, not in the media, not in the professionals, not with my teachers, not with doctors I saw. And being someone, I'm interracial, I'm Puerto Rican and Caucasian, but I was raised solely by my Puerto Rican mother, and that was my experience. That's how I've moved through the world, but not being raised in Puerto Rican communities. So it was very isolating when I was young and trying to figure out where I fit. And I remember desperately clinging to any sign of representation. In the early 80s, when I was a latchkey kid, Rachel McClish was Miss Olympia at that time, and there was a documentary on her. And this was the first time that I saw a powerful female Hispanic woman in a prominent role, and I was mesmerized by her. Nothing to do with bodybuilding, that's not my thing. I was just mesmerized by seeing this image that reflected myself. As time has gone on, I think we as a community, and I say a community encompassing a lot of communities, but we as a community have done such a good job of placing ourselves into representation and taking control of our own destiny in terms of how we're seen. I think it's been a dramatic shift. I look at this panel full of incredibly this is an impressive representation of people in a variety of fields. And the impact that has on young people and even how the world sees us really can't be understated, but it's a dramatic shift. I mean, we are more represented now. It's never going to be perfect. It's certainly far from that now, but there's been such an expansion of that I think we are now getting beyond these boxed issues that we've been given before. We are more than simply issues of undocumented individuals. We're more than issues of language. We have diversity in our own needs as a community. We have a lot to offer. And I think we're finally starting to get to a place where we're looked at in a broader sense than simply those particular issues.
Thank you for that. And actually, you provided the perfect segue for my next question, which goes to Sara. So both Yuri and Sunny brought up representation and how important it is. How do you approach or respond to or address the microaggressions and stereotypes, the general, or can cast a negative light on Hispanic and Latinx individuals, in large part and due to lack of representation of the truth of the culture?
Thank you, Lisette. One of the things that I think is really important is to recognize that there's so much complexity in the communities that we're talking about. And sometimes you find yourself in the space of being an ally. Sometimes there's a microaggression being made towards someone who identifies as an immigrant or undocumented. I'm not an immigrant, I'm not undocumented. I may still feel the impact, the harmful impact of some of those things, but sometimes I take the position of ally, and I think it's disrupting microaggressions, it's asking questions, it's imploring people. But I think one thing I wanted to name before I talk about how we address some of these situations is to really sit with ourselves and think about intent versus impact. Sometimes we may think that we are helping someone or we're disrupting a microaggression that impacts our family or our lived experiences. And I think the initial reaction is I have to say something. And sometimes that is what we need to do. We need to challenge people and the stereotypes that they have. Sometimes we need to take space. Sometimes we need to ask the person who has been the recipient of that harmful behavior, whether it's yourself or someone that you care about or colleague, because these microaggressions happen in so many spaces. And being able to circle back and ask them what they need. Do you need space? Do you need to walk away? Do you need someone to listen? Do you need your experience to be validated? Do you need, someone to feel, do you need to call someone out? And also sometimes things feel immediate. Sometimes we need to be able to give someone a moment to process and let them feel what they need to feel. I think another thing that is important is sharing stories. I know I grew up in Mississippi where there were microaggressions and there's just blatant racism against my family, against people I grew up with in the Latino community. And I think a lot of it was, unfortunately, sharing our stories, really being able to root experiences in our humanity, because so often microaggressions and racism are rooted in dehumanized stories and representation of us as numbers, as not people. And so I think a lot of this is really complex. There's no checklist of how to be a great ally and how to address microaggressions. I think one of the things that is important is to recognize that this is a learning experience. We're not going to get this perfect. We need to embrace the uncomfortable, and at the root of it, we have to listen to each other, take care of people, and own our impact.
Thank you for that answer. I mean, for such a for such a deep question, that was incredibly concise and poignant. I want to keep you online for the next question. This goes to Vilmarís and you. There's a lot of confusion about the changing terminology just across so many different communities and so forth. And one of them being the differences between Hispanic, Latinx, what to use when, who is who, all these different things. And if you maybe the two of you can give us a little bit of guidelines as things continue to change. For example, I personally have seen from country to country, Latinx, Latin with arroba at the end to be more inclusive, all these different things, right? So maybe you guys can give us a little bit of guidance along that, and if you feel comfortable, how you personally characterize your identity and background.
Sure, I'll get us started, Sara, and then you just feel free to chime in. Thank you for that question, Lisette. So I feel like there is like technical definition in terms, right? As far as like, what does Hispanic mean? And what does Latino, Latina, Latinx mean? And then I think there's a part of this conversation where it is preference. And I'm happy then to also go into like how I prefer to identify, right? But Hispanic means Hispanohablante, so someone that speaks Spanish, right? So origins of Spain. So when we say the term Hispanic, you are referring folks that are from Spain or folks who are from Latin America, but that are coming from countries of the origin that speak Spanish. So that's not Brazil, that's not Haiti, it's not other places that speak other Latin-based languages, right? And then Latinx, which is also a newer term, right? And it's just to show how language evolves, how so much evolves, right? There's so much evolution around us constantly, because that is a term that's really emerged, I would say probably in the last 10 years and probably in the last 5 years that has become more prominent. And that means anyone that comes from the region of Latin America with the base of a Latin language, right? A Romance language. So we know on this side of the world, that's Spanish, that's Portuguese, and that's French. But oftentimes I feel like Brazilians are left out of the narrative when we say Latino or Latinx or Latina, right? Even though they're part of that, right? In a technical sense, we forget about Haitians being a part of that. We forget about other Caribbean island nations that their native language is Portuguese or a Creole base of Portuguese or French, right? So again, it's super nuanced, it's super complex. It is not black and white. And oftentimes I think in the US, we love to put people in boxes, right? I mean, think about all the legal forms you ever have to fill out and how you have to self-identify. We love to truncate and put people in boxes, but it's important as we're having this conversation, as you continue your journey of learning more about our culture and this identity, that it's super complex and there's just a lot to unpack. Because what does the term Latinx mean to someone who is from an indigenous community and their Spanish is really their second language, right? Well, what does that mean? How would they truly identify, right? Versus us imposing that identity on them. So, and then personally, for whatever reason, it's literally just my preference, y'all. Like there's not like a real rhyme or reason. The word Hispano in Spanish doesn't bother me. Like my parents will say, somos Hispanos, like we're Hispanic. And that doesn't bother me. But for some reason, Hispanic in English, just something about it just doesn't sit well with my spirit. Like I don't like to be called Hispanic. Just something about it just doesn't sit right. So I identify as being Latina. And I also identify as being like Boricua, but from the diaspora, right? Because then that also gets super complicated too, because sometimes I go to the island and people are like, well, you're not really Puerto Rican, right? And it's like, yeah, but I'm part of this like mass exodus from the island that took place over decades, right? And that's how I identify. I think I'll stop there, Sara. I don't know if you want to chime in. I don't want to take up too much space, but I'll say one more thing that I think oftentimes, again, too, like this term Latino is to bring us all together to this pan Latin American experience, because it's easier for us to all say that we come together on this basis of language, of culture, of customs. But when we really strip all of that away, the root of it is colonization too, right? Which we don't like to talk about because it's uncomfortable. But that's really the root of also our lived identity and existence too. That's what bridges us together in so many ways.
Sorry, before Sara chimes in, you bring up an excellent point. I'm Venezuelan and I've been living here for 40 some odd years. But I know that, before the situation in my country right now, I would go back and I was not Venezuelan enough because I was spending most of my time in the US, but here I wasn't, Anglo or white or American anything enough to be American. So there is that sort of in between space that a lot of us live in this country, that we're not enough of this on one side and not enough of the other. So thank you for actually raising that point. Sara, please do chime in.
I want to root this in a brief, just kind of anecdote, because I think this term, Latino, Latine, Latinx, Hispanic, I think, I don't want to say like in black and white thinking that there is no unifying feeling sometimes around that, or like culturally me, saying like somos Latinos. There's so many times where I've like participated and benefited from this unifying culture, but I recognize that it leaves a lot of people out. And I also recognize it doesn't truly encapsulate my story. And actually, I think it was a term that was put on me from the time I was born for other people to understand me better. I grew up in Mississippi in a majority Black and white community, very segregated. And I was one of very few non-Black students who went to a public school system in Jackson, Mississippi. So I was identified as Mexican, and then I was identified as Hispanic, and then Latino. And like Vilmarís said, things evolved. But we came away for other people to understand me in the context of this, what felt like a very Black and white world. As I've gotten older, my identity has shifted, and I have really identified as, well, I am Peruvian, Bolivian American. I'm also biracial. I'm also bicultural. I have an Indigenous father and a white mother. That also impacts my experience immensely, because I don't have the same lived experiences as my parents, who both speak Spanish and navigate this world differently than I do. So what I would say is, these terms are imperfect, and as long as we accept that, it's not to say we can't use them or they don't serve a purpose in certain spaces, but I think we need to recognize their limitations. We need to recognize who they serve, who they don't serve, and constantly just be okay with this evolution of language and not being so tied to terminology to understand people. We can understand people by talking to them, asking them questions, asking them their preferences, and not getting so tied to these terms. That's kind of where I sit on the issue. I don't feel like I have a perfect answer. I'm just kind of along for the ride of where we go, and the conversation and the dialogue, I think, is what's really important to me.
Thank you for that, Sara. It's really profound, and you phrased that really beautifully for those of us with challenge, with communication challenges, to be honest, around these subjects. So thank you so much for that. My next question is for Hernando. How do you address the bias directed toward Hispanic and Latinx migrants versus other migrants? One of the things that Sara brought up is that most of us are such a blend of different things. I mean, even looking at Spanish background, how many, what was it, 800 years of Ottoman occupation, right? There's so much of a blend for each one of us, and not only in how we identify, as individuals, but even just as we move, from culture to culture, from our native cultures to our adopted cultures, etc. How do you see, how do you address those different biases, whether it's racial, ethnic, etc., Hispanic and Latinx migrants versus others?
Well, thank you so much for that question, Lisette. I think it's a very important question, especially in contemporary times. And to answer your question briefly before I unpack it, in terms of how do I address that bias, I address it by calling out the United States government, which is currently criminalizing our community through immigration laws. And I want to unpack that by starting with really a brief overview of the history in this country producing anti-immigration laws, right? So whether that was the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, whether that was, no Irish need apply signs, earlier in this country, whether that is even more recent in Arizona, and a law in Arizona, SB 1070, which quite literally criminalized undocumented individuals who didn't have the quote unquote proper documents. And so the reason I also want to call out, the debate is because it really doesn't matter what administration is in power, right? Whether it was the previous administration or whether it's the current administration who promised us that in 100 days, DACA recipients would have protection, and they still do not. And so I think it's important to hold those accountable. I think there's been conversations about representation, although we do have some representation, we need more of that. And we need more of that in Congress. We need more of that in state legislatures. We need more of that in city councils, because at the moment, I want to repeat that, how I answered the first question, how I address it, and I address it by calling out the criminalization of our community through laws. The other point I wanted to come across, to touch upon, is that, and I think Sara so eloquently mentioned this, that even for those of us in our community, some of us have privileges, right? Sara mentioned that she isn't undocumented. I'm also not an undocumented immigrant. I've had the privilege to come to this country already as a permanent resident, then I became a citizen. But despite those privileges that we have, I think we need to use our voice to call out, the continued injustices that some of in our community are suffering, and to use our privilege to fight for those marginalized voices. And whether that is DACA recipients who still have to live in fear, because just recently in Texas, a judge ruled, continues to come at DACA, and whether that is the horrific pictures that we saw last week of Haitian migrants getting whipped. Right? We're not living in slavery anymore. We're living in 2001 under the Joe Biden administration. So whether that's Kamala Harris not doing enough at the border, or whether that was the Donald Trump administration, severely affecting the well-being of DACA recipients. We need to continue to call this out. We need to ensure that we are no longer the sleeping giant when it comes to political terms. What we saw that our community was able to do, whether that was in Nevada or whether that was in Arizona, we have power, and we need to use that power and agency to continue calling out injustices and to continue to build and elevate our community, because what is happening in this country and the anti-immigration sentiment that is often directed at those in our community, quite frankly, is enough of that. And so I understand that this is quite a forceful answer, but I think that's what we need to do, because we're at a time where our community finally is having a voice, and we need to use it to keep on fighting for those marginalized populations that continue to be affected on a daily basis.
Thank you for that, Hernando. That's I'm going to be honest with you. I was back here inside my head going, oh my God, yes, all of that. But you actually lead me to my next question. I'm going to switch this around a little bit. And I would like to keep you in on this question. I'm bringing in Andrés, Yuri, and Sunny. What changes? Hernando mentioned all the current policies, all of the policies that we've been carrying historically as a country. What policies and changes to those policies need to be made, created, need to be addressed in general to improve the Hispanic and Latinx experience in America? I mean, Hernando touched on so many of the issues that we have right now, but what specific changes, if you could pick a couple of things, what specific changes do you think would make an immediate change for the better?
If I could segue into that, actually, with connecting something that Hernando and Yuri said at different times that stood out for me. Yuri was talking about how we are the largest minority group in this country. I want to talk about why that matters, because it's not posturing, it's not competition, it is political persuasion. That's why the numbers matter. It is power, is what it is. It's recognizing that we are a powerful group of people who have needs in this country, and that those needs make up a portion of the country that's large enough to have an impact that needs addressing. That's why we talk about what our numbers are in terms of minority groups. I've been asked that question before. Why does it matter? Why are you competing? It's not competition. It is establishing that we as a group matter in this country, that our voices matter, that our money matters, that our votes matter, and that our issues are pervasive. So I appreciated both of them talking about that in different ways and just wanted to link that.
Andrés, Yuri, and again, Hernando, what are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. I think the biggest and most obvious policy change that we need to make is immigration reform. I mean, that is key to so many opportunities in this country. And yes, not all Hispanic or Latino people in this country are immigrants or are undocumented, but a huge chunk of them are immigrants here. So if we think about what citizenship would mean, driver's licenses, for example, in Nashville and most of the cities across this country, I mean, we can't rely on public transportation. So we rely on our own transportation. Access to a car with the proper driver's license would be huge, more access to opportunities there. If we grant citizenship, we'll have better educational outcomes. In Tennessee, undocumented youth don't have access to in-state tuition because of their citizenship status. If they had citizenship, that would mean more affordable, more accessible higher education opportunities for them. Not being a citizen and being undocumented has a huge toll on our family's mental health as well. Can you imagine the fear that some families live in on a daily basis, not knowing if they're going to get picked up one day? At Conexión Américas, we help families draw powers of attorney so that their kids can be taken care of in case one day they're ever picked up and separated from their family. And I think the biggest example today is access to benefits and economic security. If you think about how many non-citizens have been left out of federal pandemic relief packages over the past year, and despite many of the immigrants being frontline workers, if they had citizenship, they would qualify for these benefits, and we'd see a lot less of the economic and food insecurity problems that we see.
Thank you.
What Andrés mentioned just now, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, go ahead. I was thanking him for laying it out so clearly for our audience today. Thank you. Go on.
What he mentioned as far as needing powers of attorney and protective documents, that's a real thing. That's an incredibly real thing in our criminal system. I've sat on both sides of the fence in our criminal system, and my mother used to work for the sheriff's department, and a position ended up being created for her because she did it so naturally in recognizing this need. The people with ICE holds who would get brought in on things, by the way, that other people would get brought in, see a fine and go home that night, end up interrupting their lives in such a significant way because no matter what happens with their criminal charges, they're still sitting in jail on these ICE holds. Meanwhile, there are apartments and children and pets and lives to deal with. So she spent a good portion of her time helping people sort out powers of attorney and guardianships, things like that, to the point the sheriff's department created an actual job. And these particular policy changes are so necessary in our criminal system. They affect everyone. They affect, of course, criminal defendants in these situations, but they also affect victims. Victims find themselves afraid to report to the police. And there's no question that police officers have often abused their power in these situations, and a victim who is making a report finds themselves either afraid of or in actuality reported to ICE. And that mixing of roles of a person in a role of protecting and serving is detrimental to the community. It doesn't allow victims to get services that they need. And that's sort of an aside from all of the things that criminal defendants have to deal with in this system. But the last thing that I want to say before I'll let you move on in terms of policy changes, I think the biggest thing is, it goes back to what we were saying before, is how we are counted. I can't overstate how many times I fill out a form or a census document that says Hispanic non-white, or is limiting in some other way. How do I count myself? My father's white, my life experience and my mother are Puerto Rican. Under that particular definition, I'm counted as white, which is reducing our numbers in the way we're counted, and it reduces the reality of our representation.
Thank you for that, Sunny. That's an excellent point, is that there are so many aspects to who we are as individuals, and such very limited ways that we are offered to explain who we are. I remember Yuri had mentioned, coming in 1992 and how it was that he was categorized at that time. I moved to this country in the mid 70s, and for the longest time, I was usually other, with no ability to explain exactly who I am and how I need to be counted, because that's what represents my voice. That takes me to my next question. So we talked about policy.
I would like to add something to that. I didn't have a chance to.
Yes, please.
Immigration reform has to be a priority, and we need you. Those that are watching that may relate or not, but we need you, because it's not a priority. It appears to be, and is used as a sort of political thing that comes in, and the rhetoric is about, engaging perhaps a segment of the population, which is huge, right? We talk about 62 million plus, but the undocumented segment of that population, 10, 12 million, who knows how many, are here for a purpose. They are workers, likely essential workers, and no one really is caring enough to take care of that situation, which we've been dealing with for decades. And I am suspicious that it's convenient because, they have sort of no rights, even though they do have rights. They have rights to get paid and compensated because of their hard work or any work they do. But because of that circumstances of their legal immigration status, they basically are utilized. There's like sort of a class of slaves of sorts that are being treated as not significant when they are. And so everyone else who may have their papers to be here or their legal status suffers also the consequences of that. But the corporations know that the Hispanic segment is important, is valuable, and they try to court us, and they know we are great consumers, and they repay loans because we have work. We have papers to work, or all of that. So, but what I'm coming down to this is that Hispanics, and I use Hispanic because it's convenient to us, to advance an agenda. I make it easier for those that are not Latin or Hispanic or Latinx to identify me. And I know that when there are census numbers, they come as Hispanics in the USA. They don't come as other, right? And just convenient for those that are not Hispanic. That's why we chose Hispanic, but it can be anything. I'll like you to call me Yuri if you can remember my name. Hispanics usually, and most of the times, are considered as a community in need, a community that of course has needs like any community, but we are not in need of your pity or your charity. We're in need of respect. We're in need of an opportunity. We're in need of appreciation, cultural appreciation, and political appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and move to our last question, which I think at this point is probably more relevant than the previous one. And that is, we have an opportunity to express right now what we would like other Americans to know about our experience as a community in the United States. So I would love to have maybe 30 seconds to a minute of each of you kind of giving me one thing that you would love our listeners to not only know, but also to share with the people around them. about what the Hispanic and Latinx experience in this country is. Let's go ahead, and since I've got Yuri on my screen right now, let's start with Yuri and run down the line.
It's a complex experience, but I would invite you to give yourself an opportunity to get to know a member of our community, wherever you are, who you may think, just, I guess, profile someone and think, okay, that may be Hispanic. Let me get to know a new Hispanic person and maybe add more to that. That sometimes is what we don't know. It's hard to understand that. And because of all of the things that we see on the news or hear from people, sometimes conservative positions that are not really founded in reality. So I would like to just share that it's a very diverse community, but at the end of the day, I think we share common interests, ideals, desires to succeed, to achieve prosperity for ourselves and our family members and friends, and we can be a great ally in the community you live, but also within the network of your close ones. And I hope you can give yourself the opportunity to embrace that.
Thank you. Sara, I'll bring it over to you.
Thanks, Lisette. I would just say, again, echoing what we've been talking about for a long time, but like, we are such a complex community. We have different gender identities. We have different religious, faith and non-faith backgrounds, right? Like, I think there's this temptation to group us together so that you can understand us, where maybe, right, like there's a lot of Catholics, or we, party in a certain way, we listen to certain music, we identify in these ways, and that's just not true. I am bisexual, I am progressive, my father is conservative, he is Catholic, we are different, we are diverse, and I think that continues to root us in our humanity. We are human, and we don't need to do or say anything to be validated in this country. We should be supported because we are human, because we have been here for a long time, many of us. If we're new, it doesn't matter. We are deserving of opportunity. We are deserving to be heard. And I don't think there's anything that should have to validate us in that. We're human, period. So I just encourage people to embrace the messiness and complexity, to run away from anything that feels monolithic, that feels like it groups us and tries to just blow over or gaslight all of these complexities of our diversity. We're not easy to understand. We're human. No humans are easy.
Thank you, Sara. How about you, Hernando?
Well, I think as Sara just touched upon, and we're not a monolithic community, right? The way perhaps a fifth generation Cuban American, Miami, Florida will vote is very different than a first generation immigrant in the state of Arizona. And so keeping that in mind, but if I can also give you all a tangible item, because I have seen in the chat so many conversations about how important data is, right? Not only quantitative, but also qualitative, right? Because our stories are just as important as the numbers, right? Hispanic serving institutions are the future of higher education in this country. Please support them. There's incredible research being done there. The students in those communities are the ones that are fighting for our community through academia. And just the way that historically Black colleges and universities just started receiving all of this funding because of, quite frankly, the murder of George Floyd, we cannot wait for a tragedy to happen in our community to get that funding that Hispanic serving institutions need. So please support them, whether that's through and not only through funding, but in through elevating the research and the work that wonderful students and faculty members are doing there. Please, please, please support Hispanic serving institutions.
Thank you for that, Hernando. Sunny, I'll take it over to you.
I have three short things. The first one being that we are the best judges of our own experience. And that sort of follows what Hernando was saying and what Sara was saying. I think the data is very important, but the qualitative data is more important. And there are a few, I can extend a lot of grace in these discussions, which goes to my second point, but what I don't typically extend grace to is someone using data to discount my personal experience or debate that. That also goes to just basic allyship. The second part of that is I think that people need to understand that we as a community are still working out a lot of these issues. You can ask any Hispanic or Latin person which term they prefer and why, and you're going to get a different answer. What their political persuasion is, they're going to get a different answer. We get to the philosophical and theoretical issues, we're still working it out. And then the third thing is, while I think that these panels are incredibly important, I'm proud to be part of them, I think it's important to recognize that our experience goes beyond what we can bring to the table, goes beyond simply our experience as Hispanic or Latin people. That feeds into our areas of expertise and how we view the world as well, but we certainly shouldn't be limited to being asked to weigh in on issues specific to these communities, because our experience feeds into the rest of our lives.
Thank you, Sunny. Andrés, I'll swing it over to you.
Yeah, I'll get specific here with some qualitative data, some story. Some of us had to grow up really fast. Some of us grew up translating for our parents in really serious situations like parent-teacher conferences or with law enforcement. And I see that in so many of the kids that are in Conexión Américas' programs. And to have that maturity and, you know, that sense of self-awareness that they have is amazing. And it's a good thing and a bad thing about being bilingual, is that your skills, your language skills get put to good use really fast.
Thank you, Andrés. And last but not least, Vilmarís, what can you share with us?
Yeah, thank you. I also just want to second so much of what other panelists have already said. So much has really resonated with me, and I agree. And I think here I'll also anecdotally just kind of plug in a story that I probably would have shared with another response to another question, but there's this academic article, and I'm going to drop it in the chat if you're able to read it, but it's titled "Teachers, Please Learn Our Names." So I think this actually goes beyond just like Hispanic, Latinx students. This goes for minoritized students, I would say, as a whole. So much of like microaggressions start at such an early age, and it's as simple as pronouncing someone's name. And that was something that me growing up in a really rural white, like Black and white community in rural Tennessee that I experienced, right? The modification of my name, people saying even now in my adulthood, yeah, I'm not even going to try that. That strips like parts of like your humanity and your existence. And I think it's taken years for me to finally be like, no, my name is Vilmarís. So when people are like, well, what's your nickname? I'm like, it's Vilmarís. Like, if you can say like characters off of Game of Thrones, I trust that you can say my name, right? So I just challenge folks in the audience that if you can't say someone's name when you first hear it, again, beyond just Latinx folks, ask again and ask again, because that intention and you trying means so much more than just never acknowledging that person or butchering it or saying it in a way that fits more accommodatingly, like to your tongue. So I don't think accommodating is a word, but I said it. So I think that's just my little tidbit there.
Thank you, Vilmarís. We do have a question here I'm seeing from our audience. Let's see, I'm an ally of the Latinx Hispanic population. I do understand the struggles that you're facing, and on the same token, largest minority group in US and Canada, you have a lot more opportunities compared to the smaller minority groups. I'm asking this question because as a South Asian Canadian, I've faced hurdles and racism by Hispanic, Latinx community and Caucasian. So the question is, how are you extending support to other communities? And I'm just gonna open it up to any panelist that would like to respond.
So I want to briefly touch upon this, and that's just because, you know, I just mentioned Hispanic serving institutions in the same vein as historically Black colleges, universities. And I mentioned, you know, the funding that HBCUs have been receiving, which I think is fantastic and quite frankly should have been happening years, if not decades before the senseless murder of George Floyd. Specifically, for me, in this academic setting, it has been building those relationships with tribal colleges and universities, historically Black colleges and universities, to learn from their experiences, to collaborate, to ensure that we are coming across of, listen, our fight is your fight, right? As I just mentioned, and what we saw earlier, the horrific pictures in the border of Haitian migrants being whipped, right? That is an opportunity for our community, right, to also call out the anti-Blackness that also exists in the Latinx community, because we also have a lot of learning and unlearning to do so that we can become better allies for the Black community that continues to experience racism, right, that continues to experience senseless murders on the streets. So for me, in this academic setting, it's really reaching out to those HBCUs, to those tribal colleges and universities, to really create this allyship moment in our communities to push this fight forward as one.
Thank you, Hernando. And you're absolutely right. I think remembering that even though we're currently discussing Hispanic and Latinx community experience, that this is an intersectional topic, regardless of who we're focusing on at the moment, that every time that we talk about a different community, we're really talking about all of us here in North America, wherever it is that we're listening from. It really is the entire population that we're trying to address. Once again, thank you to our panelists and to all of our viewers, and for the great questions and comments. People 3, back to you.
Once again, I just want to thank you all for being a part of Conversations and Experience, and we look forward to having more of these conversations to come. So thank you and have a great day.